There's a moment in one of Paul's letters where he stops talking about himself. He's in the middle of defending his own calling, answering people back in Corinth who doubted whether he was even a real apostle at all. And then, almost reluctantly, he starts describing someone else. A man, he calls him. A man who was taken somewhere no human being had any business going, who heard things he still won't repeat, and who came back from it carrying something he never expected to carry. Here's the strange part. That man was Paul. He just won't say it plainly. And once you notice that, you can't unnotice it. Why would someone hide behind the third person to describe the greatest spiritual experience of his life? That question alone is worth sitting with, but it's only the beginning of what this passage is actually asking us to see. This comes from 2 Corinthians 12, and it's one of the strangest, most restrained passages Paul ever wrote. Restrained because Paul was not usually a restrained man. He wrote about his suffering in vivid, almost uncomfortable detail elsewhere. The beatings, the shipwrecks, the nights without sleep or food. He wasn't shy about his own story anywhere else in his letters. So when he suddenly goes quiet and careful about the one experience that might have impressed people the most, that shift means something. He tells the believers in Corinth that he doesn't want to boast, that it isn't even good for him to do it. But he's about to boast anyway, because they've backed him into a corner, comparing him to other so-called super apostles who paraded their spiritual credentials like trophies. Paul hated that game. You can feel him hating it, even as he plays along, just enough to make his point, and no further. So he tells them about a man he knew, himself obviously, though he'll never quite admit it out loud, who 14 years earlier was caught up to what he calls the third heaven. Now, what did that phrase even mean to the people reading this letter for the first time? It's not language we use today, so it's easy to read past it as just a poetic way of saying way up in heaven somewhere. Actually, slow down there because it's more specific than that. Many Jewish teachers in Paul's world pictured the sky itself in layers. The first heaven was the one you could see with your own eyes, the clouds, the birds, the weather moving overhead. The second heaven was further out, the sun, the moon, the stars, the vast expanse beyond anything a bird could ever reach. And the third heaven in that picture wasn't a place you could see at all. It was where God himself was understood to dwell, past the reach of anything created. So in 2 Corinthians 12:2, when Paul says a man was caught up to the third heaven, he isn't exaggerating for effect. He's telling them, as carefully as he knows how, that this man went further than the sky, further than the stars, into the place where God's own presence rests. And then he adds something even stranger. He says the man was caught up into paradise. That word would have landed with real weight for a first century Jewish reader. It's the same word used in the story of the very beginning for the garden God planted where nothing was broken yet, where God walked with the people he had made and there was no distance between them. It's the same word Jesus uses on the cross when he turns to a dying man beside him and tells him in Luke 23:43 that this very day he will be with him in paradise. So when Paul says the man was caught up into paradise, he isn't describing some vague, generic afterlife. He's describing a return to the kind of nearness with God that existed before anything ever went wrong. But here's where Paul does something almost nobody wants to do after an experience like that. He tells us twice that he doesn't actually know what happened to his own body during it. Whether it happened in the body or out of the body, he says, he cannot say. God knows. He doesn't. That admission is worth sitting with because it cuts against nearly everything we want from a story like this. We want the mechanics. We want to know if he floated somewhere, if his heart stopped, if there's some framework we could use to sort this cleanly into real or imagined. Paul refuses to hand us that framework, not because he's hiding something, but because he genuinely doesn't have it to give. Something happened to him that broke the categories he normally used to describe his own life, and rather than force it into a shape it never had, he just tells the plain truth. He doesn't know. There's something quietly important in that. The most staggering encounter of his entire life wasn't something Paul could fully explain, even to himself. Maybe that's part of what made it real. Then comes the detail that stops most readers cold. Paul says the man heard words there, words he isn't permitted to repeat. Not words he's forgotten, not words too complicated to translate, words he was told, somehow, not to say. Why would that be? It would be easy to read that as a locked door, as though heaven is holding something back out of jealousy. But that isn't the shape of it anywhere else in Scripture. Long before Paul, Moses told Israel in Deuteronomy 29:29 that the secret things belong to the Lord, while the things God has revealed belong to us and to our children. That isn't a withholding out of spite. It's a boundary drawn out of wisdom about what a person is actually able to carry. Some things change you permanently the moment you see them, and were never meant to become a story you perform for other people. Paul was given something that fell into that second category, not a secret kept from the world out of jealousy, but an encounter too personal, too far past ordinary language to be handed to anyone else secondhand. So here's where most teaching on this passage simply stops. Paul saw something no one else got to see, heard something no one else gets to hear, and that gets treated as the whole story, a kind of spiritual highlight reel tucked into one of his letters. But if you stop there, you actually miss the entire point Paul is making, because he doesn't stop there either. He moves immediately, almost in the same breath, from the highest experience of his life to the most painful. He says that because of how extraordinary these revelations were, something was given to him to keep him from becoming proud of them. A thorn in the flesh, he calls it, in 2 Corinthians 12:7. A messenger of Satan sent to torment him. Paul never tells us what the thorn actually was. People have guessed for centuries: a chronic illness, failing eyesight, a physical disfigurement, the constant harassment of enemies who trailed him from city to city trying to undo his work. Honestly, the guessing might be missing the point entirely. If he'd named it plainly, this passage would only belong to people carrying that exact same suffering. Instead, by leaving it open, he leaves room for every reader in every generation since to place their own thorn into that same sentence. What we do know is what he did about it. He asked God 3 times to take it away. 3 separate, specific pleas, the kind that come from real desperation, not a passing complaint. And 3 times the answer was no. But it wasn't a silent no. God answered him directly. And that answer is the real center of this whole passage, the reason it's still being read 2,000 years later. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, God tells him that his grace is enough, that his strength reaches its fullest expression not despite human weakness, but inside it. Read that again slowly, because it undoes almost everything we tend to assume about how God works. We picture power showing up once the weakness is gone, once we've recovered, once we've healed, once we're finally strong enough on our own to be useful. Actually, that's not quite it either. Paul is told the opposite. The weakness doesn't get resolved before the power arrives. The power arrives inside the weakness and needs it there to be fully seen. That changes how you read everything that came before it. The vision and the thorn were never 2 separate stories loosely stitched together. They were one story from the very beginning. Paul was shown something so far beyond ordinary experience that pride would have quietly destroyed him if nothing had counterbalanced it. So grace didn't only meet him in paradise, grace met him again on the ground, in the ordinary, aching, unresolved place he had to keep living in after paradise was over. The thorn wasn't the punishment trailing behind the glory. It was mercy walking right alongside it, making sure the glory never became his undoing. That's why Paul closes this passage by saying something that would sound almost unbelievable coming from anyone else, that he'll gladly boast in his weaknesses, take pleasure in his hardships, because it's exactly there that he feels the strength of God resting on him. Not somewhere else, not later. There, in the very place he would have chosen to hide. Maybe that's the real reason he told this story wearing someone else's name to begin with. Not to hide from us, but because he understood something we still resist. That the vision was never given to make Paul impressive. It was given to teach him, and everyone who would ever read this letter after him, that the closer a person gets to God's own glory, the more their weakness becomes the very place his strength chooses to live. Has there been a season in your life when God gave you something wonderful and let something hard walk in right alongside it? And do you think now, looking back, that the hard part might have actually been the mercy?